Hey, people.
Hey.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So we're here today to discuss video game music in the music industry as a whole, from a distributor's perspective, from a music platform perspective, from a label perspective. So I'm Pony. I'm the brand manager of Sounddrop, which is a open distribution platform that caters to video game musicians, cover musicians mostly. So we have a business model and a pricing model that is specifically tailored to people who are releasing video game cover song singles on a frequent basis. So for, $10, we license it, get it on all the major music platforms, and all you have to do is upload it to our system, and you get 85% of all the money that is generated on those services by your music. So I'm Pony. This is Rusty. He works for Sounddrop as well. He's the product manager.
Hey.
That's Rebecca. She's the talent coordinator at Sounddrop. Got Jesse Buddington, who's the publishing expert at Spotify, and Sebastian Wolf, the CEO and founder of Materia Collective, which some of you might have heard of. Yeah. There the heckling begins. So I thought it'd be interesting to just kind of go through the table here and kind of review what each one of our experiences in music and with video games in general. You want to go first, Sebastian, and then we'll just work our way to the right?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. I know there's a bunch of cool concerts already started, so hanging out with us here tonight is awesome. Thanks for joining. So it's always funny to talk to people in the game industry, in the game music industry especially. You ask 10 people and you'll how did you get your start? How did you start working on music professionally? And you're going to get about 15 answers. I had sort of an interesting path. I grew up on the classical piano route. I was trying to figure out a bunch of arrangements in the early days, and there's just no sheet music out there whatsoever. And I waited about a decade, for of course the gaming industry will solve this surely, this vast missing opportunity that exists, and trying to figure out Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts sheet music in my early days. And well, I waited for 10 years and then I stopped waiting and did it myself. So it's been an absolute pleasure just working on a bunch of really cool arrangement albums, official soundtracks. We have the honor of working with things like Undertale, with Celeste, with Stardew Valley, and a bunch of other cool indie games. And we're just kind of doing the things behind the scenes, spreadsheets, licensing, royalties, the things most people don't really consider, are important. Well, it's just such a pleasure to help make the things happen, pull the strings from the backside and make sure they're done properly. That wasn't an answer, but that's what I do.
Cool. That was probably more interesting than the answer, the question that I actually asked, so that's good.
So you want musical background, video game background?
Yeah, or make up something else.
Or make up complete lies. All right, I'll tell you guys the actual story because I'm a really terrible liar. My musical background, I actually joined a boys choir when I was 6 years old, and I started doing music theory and singing, and that led to instruments. I went to college for early vocal techniques, so things like Renaissance singing, Baroque singing, things like that. I went to a panel earlier today where there was a woman who was a medievalist talking about how medieval music has influenced a lot of video game scores, both games that are set in the medieval period and games that draw from those influences, and I just had such a wonderful time at that panel. It's so rare that I get to go to things that blend, love for obscure early musical periods with love for video games, because those groups don't really overlap that much, or at least not as much as I wish they would. So video game-wise, I grew up with a Nintendo. I grew up with a Super Nintendo. Link to the Past, Chrono Trigger, two probably of my favorite games. I try to replay them once every couple of years. Business-wise, I got started in college licensing music for college a cappella groups. And that led to sort of learning copyright law, figuring out how to license music for other types of groups. And one of the first groups that we ran into, I was still working with Sebastian at that point, we decided to create a label called Joypad Records. And we took that to MAGFest for the very first time a couple years ago. And shortly thereafter, we rebranded as a company called Louder. And I know people have used Louder to get to various places. Yeah, well, I got connected with these guys because we sold part of our business to what then became Sounddrop, and the rest of our business ended up going to Spotify. So I work for Spotify now, and it's sort of weird because as a career musician, I've always had like 5 or 6 different sub-jobs that sort of combined together into a career. And I'm finding myself, for the first time this year, only having one job. And that's been a little weird. But I really love doing what I get to do, and I really love creating sort of knowledge in the broader music industry so that people who want to focus on creating music and connecting with each other can do those things instead of having to worry about how all the wheels turn behind the scenes.
Beat that, Rebecca.
Passing water down.
Nice.
Here, friends. So I guess my history with the music industry and video gaming, it kind of all starts in the same place. I grew up in a log cabin in the woods in Alaska, and we did not have electricity until I was in kindergarten. So I didn't grow up doing a lot of gaming, though that led to a lot of music. So if you don't have electricity, the way you entertain yourself is you figure out a way. So I grew up singing. I played violin and piano and French horn and bass, guitar, pretty much any instrument I could get my hands on. As I got older, my family kind of started growing, and my nephews, we really had some like special times playing video games. So I really started on PS3 playing things like Little Big Planet, Blur, which is an awesome racing game.
I love Blur.
It's so good. Yeah, and then I guess out of college, I had kind of given up on music a little bit, kind of got the like big fish in the small pond talk from a music teacher, and was like, you might want to look at some other options. I'm sure.
Is that a just really nice way of saying you kind of suck?
I think it was a really nice way of saying you
don't want to get into that.
Yeah, like you probably shouldn't audition for like the music school at NYU. Like maybe pick a different path.
Wise words.
Yes. So out of college, I really had the opportunity to start working in customer service with these awesome guys. I started there, worked in operations, and now I'm the talent coordinator at Sounddrop.
And why don't you describe real quick what does the talent coordinator at Sounddrop even do?
That's a great question.
Okay. Should we move on to
No, so I work with artists who are looking to do something bigger with their music. So it doesn't necessarily need to be the highest earning artist. If somebody wants to do something really cool, I work with them and try to make that happen for them. I'm also, do some messaging. I work with our artist service department and our content ops department to just make sure that everything's running smoothly, what we're telling people makes sense, and some other things.
We'll probably get into that more a little later here.
Yes.
Yeah.
How about you, Rusty? Have you ever played a video game?
I've played a few. Yes. Yeah, so I've been gaming since 1988 when I got an NES. It was a very important year. And then went the Sega route. And have been, it was Genesis, then it was 32X, then it was Saturn, then it was Dreamcast. And went off to college with the aspirations of computer science. I always wanted to make games, but I was also a musician. So in college, I found my voice with music. I play guitar in a couple different metal bands in the Pacific Northwest. And so when the opportunity arose to actually work in the industry and put the two things that I love in life together, like it's been really, really cool.
Nice. Well, anybody who knows me knows that I'm a fan of professional wrestling. And so I've always appreciated the wrestling games the most on NES in the arcade. On Super Nintendo, WrestleMania, the arcade game, I could beat anybody at that time. I'm sure here there'd be a million people that whip my ass, but at the time, I could beat anybody. And I remember beating my friend at WrestleMania, the arcade game, so bad that, you know those like curvy floor chairs that you sit on, you know? He pinned me down backwards, and he said, "Stop beating me!" Yeah, that's how you know you're good at a video game. I've been playing bass guitar since I was 11 years old, and you know, I have to admit it's been a very interesting experience for me with Sound Drop because I was always like a rock bass player. Then I got into jazz and went to music school, and when we first started Sound Drop, which was based on the distribution catalog that came from Louder, when we're first looking at it and looking at all the musicians and the catalog and the content that's coming through the system, I was like, these people they're all playing video game music. This is amazing. And I had never, I mean, yeah, I knew about like the mini bosses, and I knew about, there was the other.
The Advantage?
The Advantage, yeah, I knew about those bands, but I just didn't realize that there was such a deep and close and positive culture of video game music cover musicians, and it was really exciting. And so, as the brand manager for Sound Drop, my role was to figure out, you know, what's the personality of the brand? How do we communicate with the artists? Who are the artists? What is this brand for? And I was like, man, it's these video game music people, and they're amazing. And so, again, kind of like Rusty said, you know, I always loved video games, and I always loved music, and this kind of gave me that opportunity to put the two together and make the world better for everybody who does that stuff. So it's been really exciting. So, you know, in terms of playing video game music, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about what are the career paths? What are the things that a musician can do in the video game music industry, whether it's originals, soundtracks, covers? Sebastian, do you know anything about video game music and career paths and such?
Video game music? I don't think it'll catch on. It's fascinating. I don't know too many people who, you know, when they're growing up, it's like, I want to be a video game musician. At least that's when I grew up, and you know,
nowadays.
And now you start talking to a bunch of people, and it's like, wow, there's a lot of really cool music in games. I want to do that, and that's inspiring. I mean, I don't know about career paths, but I mean, even just being integrated with the game audio community, there's so many different cool types of jobs available. I mean, yes, of course, someone has to put the music in the game, someone has to compose the music, and now there's middleware jobs. You know, you talk about audio implementation, you talk about audio specialists, you talk about, you know, sound effects have to be created, recorded, mixed, mastered, sampled, made available. You know, the array of game audio jobs is endless, and I live in Seattle, and it's probably become the mecca for a lot of game audio. It used to be San Francisco, but everyone's migrating north, which is great. I love Seattle.
Well, break it down for me. Like, how does a video game soundtrack get made? Because it's like that music, you hear it so much when you're playing the game. You get so connected to it, and it's, you know, you're playing games when you're young, and things like really have an impact on you at that time. And it's like, I think a lot of people in the music industry, like the broader music industry, just think of like, you know, you talk about video game music, and they're like, you mean the music that plays in the background, like the do 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 do? You know, that's what people think. But like, nobody actually thinks about how does a video game soundtrack even get made. And I assume there's differences between the like Nintendo versus
right.
Like,
I mean, to break down
maybe?
the question, you know, there's the part of like the music industry in itself, sort of having a bit of a slant eye, like, video games, yes, surely, that's music. And here we are, a convention of 25,000 people celebrating, you know, the music and the aesthetic of everything. putting together a soundtrack is one of my favorite things. I mean, down to sort of the additional narrative arc you can build with just the track list alone. What story do you tell with your soundtrack that, is based on a very much different context? You want to definitely target a lot of the players who have these shared connections with the music, with the themes. If you're grinding on a level, and you're there for 10 minutes and trying to get to the next block, and you're going to have that melody in your head for a little bit. Or, on the opposite side, if you have an interactive game where you have more like melodic or non-melodic textures, ambiances that just kind of exist, you might not necessarily recognize it, but you have a connection with that like soundscape almost. So I think a soundtrack for a video game is something really special because you can really celebrate the music as a standalone aspect from the game that immediately connects you back to that world.
To briefly add on to what Sebastian's saying, the identity of what a piece of video game music has become so much broader because you can draw from every tradition that has come before. Right? In the very early days of video game music, we were limited by what we could program, and we were limited by what our chips could physically produce, which was sometimes 2 notes at a time, sometimes 4 notes at a time, certain limited ranges of things. And you still have people who treat music as programming. There are a lot of really, really great composers. I know Vert J. Kaufman is one of those that is most at home in a chiptune tracker, And all of the things that he does are very program-focused that then produce great music. On the other side, with file sizes and storage being what they are, there's no reason that you can't have a full orchestra and a full choir on your video game soundtrack. And as prices have gone down, to hiring those types of musicians in countries all over the world and working with them remotely, those things have become more available to a wider group of people. Also, as software, has come down in price, as people can really mix, master, track, complete an entire album on a piece of virtual hardware on their laptop. This world is really opening up to more people and to fewer numbers of people who can produce greater amounts of work.
So when you're matching the music to the game that's developed, where does it start? You've got a game, it's programmed, it's developed at beginning to end, and then it's like, all right, now let's slap some music on there, find some music. Do you hire a composer? Like, how does it work?
I wish I could speak more to the actual development cycle of it. Having talked with a great number of composers, many of them prefer to be, of course, involved very early on. One of my favorite composers, Darren Korb, I don't think he's at MAGFest this year, but he enjoys telling the story of how he was approached very early on in the development process and was able to sort of shape the identity of the game itself through the music. I mean, with all art, it's collaborative, so, you're talking to a designer. It's like, well, we're thinking about the layout in this certain way. It's like, okay, well, I thought about, like, taking the music in this very specific direction. And so it becomes more of a, ongoing collaboration rather than doing what I think far too many game developers do and say, well, we have this completed game. I suppose we should start thinking about the music before we release it. And, if anyone is thinking of developing a game, the moment you hire an artist or the moment you start working or collaborating with someone, consider starting to work with a composer as well. I mean, branch outside.
You'll end up with a better product. Yeah.
Exactly.
And obviously, some of the big publishers probably have in-house, entire in-house teams. But then the indie games, they're like, oh, I want this composer, or oh, I know this composer, and they were working together from the start. I guess it could be any different way.
Maybe.
The video game world is starting to do what the film world does, where you see Hans Zimmer's name on all kinds of different films, and you're starting to see particular composer names on different soundtracks, and people know that their game's going to have a good soundtrack if you see a particular composer name on it. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah. Do you ever hear of instances where it's like, I don't want it to sound like that other game, so I want to find somebody new?
I haven't heard of that. I'm sure it happens all the time, but especially as Jesse mentioned earlier, the accessibility of music creation, the barrier of entry becomes so much lower. You can create music almost for free at this point.
Yep.
So I think it's very easy for new composers, new creators to develop an identity very early on, and sort of shape it and say, hey, I saw this cool game that you're working on. Do you need a composer? Do you have someone that you want to create this ambient texture that represents your game?
Yeah, my favorite example of that actually is John Robert Matz, who I know is here, wrote the music for Artemis. And he originally just took footage of himself and his friends playing the game and orchestrated a little score to that clip that he had taken and then sent it to the developers and said, hey, I put your thing to some music that I wrote. And they ended up writing him back and were like, hey, can you compose music for our game?
That's awesome.
So.
In these cases, who owns the rights to the audio recording, the soundtrack? Oh, okay.
What does the contract say?
What does the contract say?
Is there a contract?
Is there a contract? Please have contracts. Please work with someone to write you an agreement. There's
Yeah. It's complicated.
It's complicated. As per Facebook relationship status, it's very complicated. Having worked in music rights for about a decade at this point, it's one of those often forgotten concepts. Like, okay, well, we'll just create the music and put it in the game and release a soundtrack. Have contracts, even if it's like, I will write you this music and I get to own the rights and you get to put it in the game, written on a napkin. That's still better than nothing at all.
If you are co-making a game with your childhood best friend who you trust with your life, that is the time when you most need a contract. Thank you.
Yeah. The moment money is involved in any kind of a creative pursuit, if you're releasing a soundtrack, if you're collaborating on something, even if you don't expect it to really take off, there's always that chance. Far too many, not too many indie games, it's great. Many indie games have taken off, and it's like all of a sudden you have millions of units of games that have been sold and create revenue. It becomes more difficult to retroactively say, hey, so I know we talked about this thing 4.5 years ago in an email that was deleted, I'm so sorry. Can I buy my rights back? It's much more difficult in that scenario, so.
So with a sound, like a VGM label, you sell full soundtracks, the original audio, and then also like, orchestral Zelda sound albums, right? So, that's got to work different ways from the label perspective. How does it work for a label?
I think one of my favorite things has been, having worked in video games for about a decade. What I love about Materia is that we can sort of bridge the creator and the fan worlds. With something like 2 years ago, we created a orchestrated Zelda Ocarina of Time soundtrack. We recorded in Eastern Europe. It charted on Billboard. It sold tens of thousands of copies through our friends at I'm 8-Bit. And that's sort of the scope of what's possible at this point. Of course, it's a vastly different world than an original soundtrack that gets to be put out, but we're all here because we love games and we really love the music of it. And I think having more opportunities to celebrate that music on our own terms, the way we really want to do it, I think is really special. For soundtracks, there are so many special things we can do as well. Vinyl is coming back. I say questioningly, having released several vinyls of myself at this point, but it's cool to have music that's celebrated in a different context, in a different medium, and having the capacity to do so. And of course, going back to the question, like, having cover albums and remix albums and reorchestrated albums, I don't really see them as separate sort of identities as a soundtrack. At the end of the day, we're celebrating music that we all know and love and that connects something special for us. So finding ways to create the things we want to is important.
Yeah, and that's such a good point too, because it's funny, I've always been a big fan of the band Rush. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of Rush, yeah. But you know, if somebody covers La Via Strangiato, you know, I might be interested and listen to that once or twice and be like, okay, but really what I want to hear is Rush's version. With video game music, though, I want to hear the orchestral version. I want to hear the prog metal version. I want to hear the saxophone version. I want to hear like all these different versions, and I want to hear the same song over and over played in a million different styles. And I think it's really interesting to me how video game music is unique in that way. I don't just sit home and throw on the original Super Mario Brothers soundtrack. I mean, I might, but I'm just as likely to listen to any one of y'all's covers of it, and it's really cool, and it's interesting how video game music is unique in that way. So for a cover song artist, specifically in the video game music world, you want to get that music, you know, on Spotify, on all the streaming platforms, Apple Music, all those places, and you know, and that's where Sounddrop comes in. So yeah, it's just a very easy platform where you just upload your music, and you know, we make sure the licensing is in place, and we get it on all the major platforms for you, and then as the music sells, money funnels back through us, and we send a monthly paycheck. So Rusty, you're the guy that kind of, you know, makes sure all the pipes are connected and all the stuff's working on the back end with Sounddrop. Maybe you could just kind of describe just a real high-level overview of how that works. Like, how are we plugged into all those services, and what are we doing there?
Well, so basically every store that we deliver to has a different way that they want content delivered. They all have different standards, they all have different formats. And so what we do is we make sure that we get the most universally accepted formats and metadata, and we send all of it off.
How do we send it off? What does that even mean? We just email it to them?
Well, we upload it.
That's what I would do.
We upload it to FTP sites, or we will send it directly through like a DDEX feed. And yeah, every partner is different. As money starts to come back, we track mechanical royalties, and then we make sure to send those off to Louder, so that all of the original publishers get paid for all cover songs.
Yeah, and there's like, you know, there's these things that are, these lines that are connected to these services, and at any minute, any little thing can go wrong, you know, on their end, on our end, and so, you know, there's a whole business involved in just making sure that the stuff is flowing, that the
naming conventions on folders that are uploading. Yeah.
Random stuff like that nobody would ever even care about or think about. But I guess we're talking about it here. So when an artist is uploading their music to a platform like that, Rebecca, what are some of the requirements that, just to like, hey, I want to cover a video game song, I recorded it, now what?
Yeah, totally. So like Rusty said, every store is different. Every store has a little bit different requirements. So what we do is we give you fields to give us all of the information that the stores need, and then we reformat kind of that information. However, when you're signing up your music with any distribution service, what you want to think about is it's a retail package. So it's almost like if you're taking your sound recording from YouTube, it's almost like going from selling a craft on Etsy to selling it in Walmart. So if you're selling it on Etsy, it's just direct customer. You can kind of customize things, make any changes you want to the product. However, when you're releasing it in an actual retailer, you need a UPC. You need the product to be consistent. So stores aren't going to want people to download your music and it be different for one person versus another person. So we can help facilitate that. The major things are really, think of it like a high school paper. You want the grammar to be correct. You want to make sure you're reading through all of the information, all the requirements the teacher's asking you for. please make sure you're casing your submissions correctly. That's actually a very important thing to do. Like make sure like your track titles aren't all lowercase or all uppercase. There might be some exceptions, but for the most part, you want it to look as professional and clean as possible, just to make sure that everything remains live.
Yeah, and any of those upload platforms like SoundDrop or CD Baby or DistroKid or any of those, they should have documentation that tells you exactly how that stuff needs to be formatted, what the audio file format needs to be, and the bit rate or whatever, and like what the track titles should look like, and what's an acceptable artist name, because even that's something you got to think about.
Yeah,
yeah, what are some of the common mistakes that we see?
Casing is a big one. If you have artist names are really hard because we definitely understand like different casing on artist names is really important, especially if you're an artist who releases on YouTube. You're probably using maybe some different casing rather than kind of the standard conventions. So if you can give us web presence or give anybody web presence ahead of time, most of the time we can just let that right through.
So if your artist name is like 2 words pushed together without a space, all lowercase, I'm sure none of you guys do that.
The other thing is your cover art. So kind of going back to the making sure that something's retail ready. Like if you're using copyrighted characters on your cover art is something that we see a lot. So that might be something that's okay on a different platform, but when you're packaging something up for sale, you want to make sure that you have the rights to all the content. So it would be like using like Josh Groban on your can of soda and saying that he's your official spokesperson. When
we getting into blue peanut butter territory here?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Don't use Pikachu on your cover. don't put Pikachu on your cover art.
Don't do that. Yes. Also, like the information on your art needs to be really specific, so everything needs to match your album title, your artist name, all the performing artists. So like, there's some pretty specific things. Like Pony said, whatever company you're using to get your music out to these retailers should be telling you exactly how, what the requirements are and how to get that done. On our end, and for most distribution companies, we have a content approval team that looks through every single release that comes through the system to verify that everything is formatted correctly. It looks like you have the rights, so nobody is uploading something from a famous artist claiming for that to be theirs. And if something is wrong, they will send you an email and ask you to change it. And I think one of the big misunderstandings is those changes may be optional. And in some cases, we can like really work with those guidelines, but it's really important to like read through all those requirements and make sure that you're understanding what needs to be done.
So in terms of getting your music out there, different like content platforms have different rules. So, you know, the rules for what you can live stream on Twitch versus what you can upload in a video format to YouTube versus what you can send to Spotify and Apple Music, each one of those have different rules, right? Like, what are the differences between these platforms, and like, what do people have to know when they're using each one of them?
Yeah, so I mean, we kind of went over how to use like a distribution platform, like how you're going to get the correct metadata, get all the right audio files. In terms of like YouTube and Twitch, there's, you know, like I said, a little more flexibility. However, the other thing to keep in mind is with YouTube, especially if you're using, like if you're doing a remix and you're using audio from a video game or anything like that, it's totally possible that you'll get, you won't be able to claim any ad revenue on that if you haven't obtained permission to begin with. So that's one of the big misunderstandings I see in terms of.
Yeah, but it's still allowed.
It's still allowed, yeah. So
because YouTube's system can
identify
that.
You just can't claim any ad money on it. So you can release it as your artistic creation, but if you don't have permission to use the audio, the original or whoever owns the rights will get the ad revenue.
Gotcha. Okay, so now, but if you're putting the music on, say, Apple Music or Spotify, now there's a separate rule set that applies to those, right?
Yep. Yep, exactly. So it's kind of what we went over in terms of copyrighted content. It's kind of the same, though the repercussions are a little more serious if you're like remixing music and you don't have permission from the original copyright owner. There's rights disputes that can happen. Also, going back to the contracts point, please do get contracts for anybody you're collaborating with. There's, like, I've seen some really sad cases where kind of co-creators are putting rights disputes against each other and then no one could release their music, which is a real bummer. So contracts are important.
Right on. So maybe Sebastian or Jesse, like, any advice for somebody who's just starting to get into the game, either whether they're composing their own original music that they want to shop around to developers or publishers, or versus somebody who's just doing covers of existing music?
Starting out, it's hard. I started out on YouTube in 2007, 6. It's been a while. Back when it was sort of this poorly designed, slowly buffering video platform, just starting out. It was great. Played a bunch of piano badly. Don't look it up. I think the same thing still sort of applies as it did then. You know, if you're creating content, you know, in part you're not only beholden to sort of what you want to create, but also what you want people to experience. And you know, two of the most important factors are quality and consistency. You know, it doesn't really matter to a larger extent sort of the individual pieces that you're making, but sort of having a strategy and a plan in place about, well, you know, I want to, you know, create a new cover 2 times every month and release it. You know, make sure it's good, make sure you tell absolutely everyone, and make sure that you sort of commit to a schedule. You know, I'm sure there's lots of other panels, especially here at MAGFest, about you know, sort of strategies around like becoming a creator and sort of all the different tools and platforms that are available. You know, with between Sounddrop and Twitch and YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, and you know, between all the different places you can now share your creations. I think quality and consistency are sort of the 2 cornerstones.
Yeah, to add on to that, definitely on the distribution side, in terms of schedule, I've seen a lot of people get more followers and get, you know, really get a base just because they're releasing on a consistent basis. Mm-hmm. People know what to expect. Mm-hmm. That's definitely.
Yeah, I think there's also, like, there's this kind of triforce, if you will, of like, what really resonates with you as a creator, what resonates with a listener, and then where is there a niche that isn't being saturated. And you know, I wouldn't be sitting here as a brand manager if I knew the secret to that. I would be a musician myself. But I think it varies. Like, everybody's different, you know. So there's like, you gotta know what people are hearing. You gotta know what you're feeling, and you gotta find that opening. And I think that's advice from just somebody who just sees people that are doing it to a lot of success and people that are just starting out with it. I think that one of the really interesting things about video game music is how the broader music industry, it's kind of like this, it's this thing over here, you know? There's like, oh, the rock bands, the hip hop bands, pop country, stuff that's like the Grammys. Is there even a Grammy for, is there a Grammy for video game soundtrack?
Kind of. Sort of.
Is there? Sort of, what is it? No, I mean an actual Grammy.
Like, a video game soundtrack can win a soundtrack Grammy, but I don't know that there's a specific video game category.
Has that ever happened? So, Jesse, what are, like, from your perspective, I mean, you're in a unique position here over there at Spotify. Like, what are you seeing in terms of, like, what the music industry's sense of video game music is?
It's interesting, actually. I would say that the broader music industry does not really understand video game music the way that I think we in this room may. And I actually would also say that most video game studios do not understand video game music in the way that we in this room do. And I think that's really enlightening. Most video game studios that we talked to when we were trying to get the rights from them back in the Louder days, they didn't really think of their music as a separate property from the game. They really thought about it as one self-contained package. And this is true of the other assets in the game, too. They didn't think about their sprite art assets as a different thing that could be given to fans. You know, a lot of companies do sort of logo packages, right? They tell you how you can use their brand name. They give you the fonts that their brand uses, and they encourage you to use those assets. They have branding pages. Louder actually had one. I believe Spotify also has one. But video game companies don't have those things. There isn't a page that says, well, this is an acceptable use of Mario, right? They just say you can't use Mario. And that's really a shame, because there's a lot of people that would create really good art under those guidelines. You know, one of the things about the Sounddrop requirements is that those of you who have uploaded something to Sounddrop or DistroKid or any of those other companies, you've had to follow that style guide, and you've had to follow the style guide from iTunes, which it incorporates. You've had to follow the style guide from Spotify, which it incorporates. And people are good at following rules if you give them clear rules to follow. And if you're not giving them any recourse, you're not giving them any rules, then they're going to do what they think is best, which is not going to be, you know, consistent or, you know, perhaps the way that you would wish that they act. So the interesting thing about the broader music industry is that it sort of doesn't understand that video game music is a property in and of itself, and that oftentimes a really terrible game with lousy mechanics can have an incredible soundtrack, or a game with incredible mechanics and a wonderful story and beautiful characters and a fascinating art style can have just the worst music ever made, and that those two things can be separated from one another, and every once in a while they combine into, you know, a great whole, and you get sort of a perfect game. But yeah, we're just starting to understand that on a broader industry scale. I would say from a metadata perspective and from a rights perspective, since those are the things that I work most closely on, a lot of people don't understand that the video game industry is not contained within the music industry, and so video game music uses rules that are more similar to programming. It uses rules that are more similar to tech startups. I was walking through the Indie Arcade and looking at all of the banners and the different tech demos and the different playable demos, and I was thinking to myself, every single one of these games is a startup. And so indie games especially follow much more the rules or lack of rules in startup culture than the established sort of record industry rules of the music industry. As somebody at Louder and as somebody at Spotify, you know, we can go to a video game studio and we can say, hey, can you provide us with a DDEX feed of all of your metadata for all of your compositions, all of your, you know, tracks that embody those compositions? And oftentimes they'll go, these tracks don't even have titles. This is World 1-1. And this game by this same composer, which is a completely different song, that's also World 1-1. I cannot tell you how many things we have called intro.
Main theme.
Main theme.
Yeah.
My favorite.
Title credits. Staff roll.
Sort of the equivalent of, you know, untitled track 1 by unknown artist.
Pause menu, you know, like all of these things that people use the same title over and over and over again. There are 2 tracks called Overworld by Koji Kondo. One goes do 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 do, and the other one goes do 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 do. They're both called the exact same thing, and they're by the exact same composer. So metadata-wise, they are identical, and it is such a pain to drag those 2 things apart because they are 2 incredibly different songs.
Which is so weird because when Jurassic Park movie comes out, the soundtrack comes out as its own standalone product, the music is celebrated, it gets treated like its own album, and sometimes movie soundtracks ultimately become more popular than the movie even.
Yeah.
And it's just, it is strange. What do you think it would take? What are these missing pieces that are preventing the video game industry from treating its music the way the movie industry does?
So I think one thing is that video games and video game studios have to treat their composers like, standalone creators that they are collaborating with. And I think if you start to do that, then the composer gets a lot of control over their content because they are providing a license for it to the video game studio instead of creating it as a work for hire under the video game studio. Generally, we see that composers want their work to be used, and composers want their work to be celebrated. And it is oftentimes ambiguity. It's not even that the studio doesn't want that, it's that the studio doesn't know who can grant that ability. So because of that ambiguity, you have a lot of soundtracks get sort of mired in this land of, is it really financially viable for us to even figure out the answer to this question? It's going to involve a lot of our lawyer time. If we're a big studio, we have in-house lawyers. If we're a little studio, we're going to have to hire a lawyer. It's going to cost us a lot of money up front to even answer the question, who owns the rights to this thing so that this project can go forward? And oftentimes they'll say, it's just not worth it for us to do that calculation. Then you end up with people, releasing things under less legal channels, and then everybody's worried about lawsuits and takedowns and DMCA notices and all that sort of thing. In order to kind of change that process, I think what we really need is to understand the role of the fan creator, which is sort of in between, fans who are just consumers and people who are just creators. You have this person who's a fan of the original creation who wants to create their own subsequent creation, which we refer to often as a derivative work. We don't really have good support in the US, especially for derivative works. We have compulsory licenses. I can get into this a little bit later if we want to talk about rights, but the compulsory license doesn't really help derivative works. Derivative works fall into this weird gray area where it might be transformative, which would make it fair use, or it might be infringing if the law takes an unfavorable view of it. And so figuring out how to do derivative works properly, which is a huge problem, right? If somebody is on a YouTube video and they're performing a cover song with a guitar and their guitar has a sticker of Sonic the Hedgehog on it and they're wearing a Mario t-shirt and they've got their Zelda hat on, how granularly do we want to break down those rights, right? They've got a poster of Crash Bandicoot in the background. These are all different, things that might get some fractional percentage of ad revenue that goes onto that thing. And we're not really good at determining, well, you have 17% of Mario's foot showing, so that means that he's going to get 2 cents every time, that kind of thing. I think it's a thing we could figure out. I think it's a thing we could figure out with technology and machinery so that ordinary people, can just get the rights and don't have to think about it. But we're a ways off from doing that.
Following up on a lot of that,
Sorry, I know that was a lot.
No, that was fantastic, and there's a lot of truth to what Jesse said as well. I think there has to be more education on sort of both sides. As game musicians, we sort of find ourselves as part of two sort of disparate industries. And I think, me personally, I do a lot of work in education and have over the last 2 years. I spoke at Audio Kinetic and WISE events. They do sort of middleware stuff. I've spoken with music industry professionals about the game industry. I'll be speaking at the Game Developers Conference about music monetization. And sort of you have these very basic concepts, about the game industry, sometimes, there's audio and video put together, and the music industry is wow, that's amazing. And on the game side, sometimes it's well, if video game music gets performed live, there's some royalties that fall off, and they're just wow, that's amazing. So sort of breaking down even the very basics of the other industry and sort of raising the words, the standard knowledge base with both sides helps. Yeah.
The good news, though, is that all you video game cover musicians are way ahead of the curve, and the music industry needs to catch up to you. So, with that said, do you guys have any questions? I see a microphone there. I think this guy's got a question. Oh yeah, just line up.
Fight to the death.
And if you stay till the end, we've got a little bit of swag here.
Okay, so they turned this on.
on?
Okay, I'll just say it loud. So I actually do want to talk about compulsory licensing and derivative works and that sort of thing. It seems like the cover music community is able to thrive, and we're able to do all of this stuff because we have this compulsory regime. It's very easy. We know exactly what we need to pay, that sort of thing. But it does have these gray areas. There was a thing a few months ago where DistroKid made a scare of, if you're doing translations of, Japanese songs, then maybe they can't really license it. It gets back to that, derivative work versus, what's allowed. What do you think about these sort of gray areas between what you're actually allowed to do in a compulsory license versus what may not necessarily, be policed as well? And also, I would like you to add a little bit of thoughts on YouTube, because a lot of times, YouTube, because it's sync licensing, it can't fall into that as well.
Can I take that?
I'll just do the intro. Fantastic question, and this goes pretty deep into the nitty-gritty
We've got that one
nuance
before.
of it. But
Yeah.
one thing that Jesse said a little bit earlier, I think, is probably the best answer. Like as creators, as owners of copyright, I think it's important for us, even if we're composing, to provide acceptable use formulas. For example, Bethesda has an entire page that says you can use our game footage, our Let's Plays, you can use the music in these certain ways, and you cannot use them in these other ways. And I think lack of policies like that sort of means that us as fans, us as people and creators of derivative content, just well, I'm going to do this because no one has told me not to.
These are also things that will evolve over time. I know Nintendo recently updated its YouTube policy because its original YouTube policy was very limited, and people had a bunch of complaints about it. People had problems, giving up a lot of their revenue when doing Let's Plays, things like that. People were actually boycotting playing Nintendo games, and so that reduced their awareness. Nintendo realized they weren't actually making that much money off of their, YouTube income. And so they decided to revamp their policy to what it is now, where you can use a great body of their work in order to do your own playthrough videos and commentary videos. They do specifically mention that you can't use other parts of their intellectual property, which does include, unreleased music, that sort of thing. To answer your derivative work question, it's really tough. It's particularly tough for video game music because video game music falls into the category of audiovisual works. And the compulsory license has a specific exemption for audiovisual works, which was originally designed for movies. They didn't want you to just go to a film in a theater and learn the music and take it and cover your own version of it and be able to, profit off of that before the original had been released as a phono recording, so as a record or a piano roll at that point. And now you have a situation where somebody can buy a game disc and they can play it for 85 hours and they can listen to that song over and over and over and over again because I suck at Super Meat Boy and so I keep hearing the same, song again and again. And the use case has changed, right? If somebody is listening to the same song over and over again while they die for 85 hours, they shouldn't be barred from making their own version of that music. Right? They've essentially taken a private copy into their homes. But unfortunately, the law has not really caught up with that yet, and we still give the audiovisual exemption to things that exist on DVD or things that exist on game discs or as downloadables. I think that will change in due time, but a lot of these regulatory changes happen very, very slowly. How many of you know that we just passed a major piece of copyright legislation in the US? Yes. It's called the Music Modernization Act, and it brings us into parity with a lot of other countries in the world. We now are going to create a single licensing authority that everybody like Spotify will pay into, and everybody who are music publishers and owners of music compositions will get money out of. This is the first major piece of legislation we've passed since the DMCA, which I believe passed in 2000. So copyright legislation in the US goes very, very slowly. And unfortunately, technological development, particularly electronic technological development in the US, goes very, very quickly. So by the time we, have figured out everything for, these kinds of audiovisual works, we might be on to doing things where we download information directly onto our brains or have holograms, and then people are going to be like, well, I don't know, just adapt the piano roll thing to work for the brain storage.
Yeah, it seems like the creators and consumers are always a couple steps ahead of the institutions that are determining the rules that creators and consumers are working within. So,
you want to go to the
just keep going. Yeah, next question.
You're good.
So it seems that even outside of the video game industry, covers are extremely easy to make. Like, there are professionals that, like, they don't even necessarily change anything. They just sing the song the same way someone else sung it. And it's strange because, like, you have situations with, a cover is a derivative work, but it doesn't seem to get treated the same way as other derivative works. What are the legal processes that allow covers to be so free, whereas something like a fan game of, like, Fallout or something is not permissible, but a cover that's basically the same thing as another musical work is 100% okay?
Probably a good time to preface that we're not attorneys.
Yes, this is not legal advice. I am not a lawyer. That's a really good question. The reason for that is because musical compositions specifically have a compulsory license that you can benefit from. Basically, anybody in the US who wants to can cover any song that has been previously released in an official capacity to the public as a phonorecord by the original copyright owner. And so what that means is that it's very easy for a normal person to get those rights just by following the procedural steps outlined in copyright law. Those same steps, that same type of license, does not exist for other types of works. So if you're trying to create a fan game, and honestly, I kind of wish it did. I wish we had these, like, here's this category of thing I want to make, here's this money I'm prepared to pay, everything is all laid out, I can now do my thing, right? It helps promote future growth and future innovation. But we don't have those things in terms of fan games. We don't have those things in terms of fan art. We don't have those things in terms of fan fiction. So any kind of derivative work that you want to make in those regards, you need to do direct licensing, which follows a willing buyer, willing seller model, where someone can just say, no, I don't want you using that. There are certain types of music licensing that do follow that. For example, sync licensing. If you want a song to appear in a film, you need to license the sound recording from someone, and you need to license the underlying musical composition from someone. This is why a lot of productions will have these stripped down sort of indie covers because they can't get the original sound recording. So they'll get a band that they can license their sound recording from, and then they have to just license the original composition. But once they do so, they'll be able to put that thing in their film. If the composer or their publisher says, no, I don't want you using my musical composition for that use, then they're blocked on that one and they have to do something else, or they have to try to throw more money at the problem. It's actually really interesting. There's a lot of situations where artists will come out saying, such and such politician used my thing for their political rally and I didn't like it, and I'm sending them a cease and desist. That makes big news, it makes headlines all the time. That cease and desist does nothing. There's actually a specific exemption in copyright law for people to use whatever music they feel like during their political campaigns. So even though you see those things in the news, and people write about these topics a lot, not because they don't understand the law, because a lot of these people that write on that topic fully understand the law. They just know that it will create a sensational article. And so they have it prepped. They're like, oh man, this is gonna be great. Like, as soon as this artist sends their cease and desist notice, we're gonna write about it, and we're gonna write about how, like, there was no official response from the candidate and that sort of thing. They've got all the steps planned out.
So we are running short on time, but who's going to cut me off? Does somebody have a cane out here and they're going to pull us off?
Oh, let's keep going.
Can we just keep going? Grab, just get the questions? All right, keep it coming.
Hey, what's up?
Yep.
So it's my understanding when you release a cover, if you're selling it, anytime you sell a physical copy or digital download, you owe the publishers their 9 cents. But when you're streaming, like on Spotify or whatever, they get no cut of that. That goes strictly, basically it's master rights. But in my experience, streaming is the largest consumption of music, and I can only see that trend growing. So do you think publishers might grow savvy to that and maybe start looking?
So there actually is a publishing royalty that comes out during streaming, and Spotify handles that. Spotify does all of its licensing for all of its own songs on its platform. I believe Apple Music also does that licensing, and all of those things are transferred to publishers behind the scenes. So you guys, as the uploaders of the sound recording, don't have to worry about licensing that stuff. The only exemption to that would be it has to be a song that is subject to the compulsory license. So if you're creating a song that is based on an unreleased piece of music or a piece that has only been released in the audio-visual format of a game or a movie and has never appeared on a soundtrack album, you might be on the hook for that particular thing not being licensed and those royalties not being paid.
Right, yeah. We get a question a lot, which is, why is my cover song grayed out on XYZ platform? And a lot of times it's for this exact reason, that whatever streaming service just couldn't show that there is, it was subject to compulsory licenses.
Yep. I was just going to say, just to be clear, yeah, there is a publishing royalty due on every stream. It's just not 9 cents, because that would be
yeah, the streaming royalty rates are complicated and fractional.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's a lot of tiny little numbers to crunch.
As I do, my company Materia also represents music publishing administration for a catalog of about 2,500 indie works for games. Between Spotify and Amazon, that's probably our biggest revenue source. Just streaming royalties, because that's where the consumer models are shifting towards. So there's definitely money there.
I'm glad that it's making its way to you.
You know, after like 7 quarters in limbo, it's fine. Music industry.
Ooh, let's take this one off stage, guys.
Thank you.
This is one, Brian. I kind of want to play devil's advocate a little bit. Just see what you think. So obviously, composers will always want to retain the rights as much of their own music as they can, because thank you. Composers will naturally want to retain as much of their own rights as they can, because why wouldn't they? It's their artwork. But to play devil's advocate from the other side, you know, from a business ethics standpoint, you know, if I hire a contractor to build me a house, he doesn't own my house. If I hire a chef to cook me food, he doesn't own my food. If I hire a musician to make me music, why should I not own that music?
Yeah, so I can take that question. So there's definitely cases where, I mean, that is exactly what happened. So work for hire, for example, and it's all kind of based on what the composer chooses to do, right? So if you can find someone who's going to work for hire for you and create music, that's awesome. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. However, I do think you know, video game composers should also kind of stand up for their rights, which whatever they think is right.
Yeah, of course.
To add on to that, the way that I see this most often work out in the industry is that doing a buyout is something that is worth extra money, right? So a composer will say, you know, you can either leave me with my rights and pay me half of what you're going to pay me, or you can pay me the full rate that you're going to pay me, and you get to keep my rights. But you know, it's a valuable piece of ownership that can then be traded away, much like a piece of real property. This also reminded me of a story, and it's actually directly related to video games. An article popped up recently about famous athletes in like NBA 2K and things like that, and their iconic tattoos that they have. Now, when you get a tattoo, unless you have an agreement that says otherwise, the tattoo artist who puts it on you owns your tattoo. There is an implied license that says that you can do whatever you want with the one that's on your skin, right? And you can be photographed with it, and that's totally fine. If someone wants to recreate you as a digital character, there is currently a debate going on over whether or not that tattoo artist could sue for that unauthorized reproduction or not, because it's not your actual person, it's a digital avatar that represents you.
Welcome to 2019.
Yeah. Things you never thought would be litigated about are being litigated.
There's 3 attorney panels, like 2 left for MAGFest. One is about intellectual property, so I think that would be a fantastic question to ask.
Yeah, somebody should ask them about tattoo law. Digital tattoo law.
To sort of complete that question as well, as composers and creators, I think it's important to have rates. And a buyout isn't just a buyout; it's a bundle of rights that you grant someone. It's like, well, my full rate is okay, $8,000 per minute. You probably don't need all of these rights, but I can give you a discount and do a percentage of that, and you get perpetual use. You get to use it in any kind of game. I get to keep the soundtrack rights and the publishing rights, and I get to actually own the copyright. And that is going to cost you a significant amount less. So I think it's very important for us as composers, as creators, to understand what rights we have that we can grant so that we can charge accordingly.
Yeah. That was a good question.
So for releasing on the big platforms, Spotify, iTunes, etc., and we're just going to ignore for this that iTunes can just decide, no, your music has to wait because we want to re-quality check it. When you're trying to get the rights and the licenses and all this, obviously if I put on that I'm doing this cover and it's from Final Fantasy, anywhere 2 from 9, you've got about 2 or 3 sources you have to go to, and it's pretty straightforward. But then if I say, this cover's from an old Apogee platformer, or it's from Lunar, and who knows who owns Idea Workshop anymore. Because of things like that, how long would you say you need time-wise between going to something like Sounddrop and the actual release to make sure that all the licenses are in place?
We always say give it 3 weeks.
Yeah.
For licensing to check out one way or another. The question about licensing music from not ransomware, but what's the vaporware, yeah, is super interesting. And as somebody who fondly remembers Apogee, maybe Jesse could weigh in on licensing music from now defunct games and abandoned publishers.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Again, the compulsory license that you can get is predicated on there having been an official phonorecord release. So in a case where the only thing that was ever released was the game, if the game is young enough to still be under copyright, which generally means that it was either created less than 95 years ago for a corporately owned thing, or the last surviving author has not yet been dead 70 years. If neither of those conditions are met for it to be in the public domain, basically you have to find out who currently owns those rights. And if no one can tell you who owns those rights, then it can't be licensed. Now, whether or not someone will come forward and sue you is a different question, but that's one that you have to determine when figuring out how to release your music and that sort of thing. I'm certainly not advocating that anybody break the law, but if no one is likely to come forward, and you know that for reasonable certainty, the impact is probably low.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, and one of the things that we do is try to apply the experience that we've kind of gained over the years to help make those determinations and say, like, this stuff's fine, nobody cares, versus like, no, don't distribute that, it'll get taken down, it'll be a problem.
I'm very new to Sounddrop, clearly.
I like your hat.
What kind of advice, since you all are obviously well-versed in the greater music industry, the digital distribution of all of these things, what would you say to someone who is very interested professionally in learning more about the inner workings, the metadata, someone who's interested in obviously all these different laws, new and old? Is there some sort of great resource that you've all come to find that's been helpful?
Working in it and just dealing with it day after day.
The trenches, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there are just tons and tons of classes and, all kinds of things. Usually in our case, we learn because we have to. It's like, oh, this situation, crap, what happens here? And we have to figure it out, put processes in place, a lot of times develop technology to match that. But as far as like a specific resource to point you to say like, oh yeah, this is how.
Like a reading list.
What's that?
Like a reading list or.
I do have a reading list. I'm happy to share links with anyone. Just find me after. The sort of my Bible is What They'll Never Tell You About the Music Business by Peter M. Thal, I think.
Okay.
That's just kind of like the go-to, like, here's the music industry as it was in 2013 when the book was published. Good baseline. probably doesn't dive super deep into the metadata, but it focuses more on the inner workings of the music industry and why certain things are the way they are currently.
If you want something rights specific, there's a small book called A Plain and Simple Guide to Music Publishing. It's written by Randall Wixon, who is, he represents Journey and other such problematic bands. And he is one of the most persnickety people I've ever met, and I really appreciate his book.
Yeah, and I'd say in terms of resources to not use as a credible resource, any type of forums, general word of mouth, I have seen some very wrong info on Reddit forums. So
Reddit.
if anyone's looking for info, definitely go direct source.
And in general, stuff's going to be outdated within a year, so it's tough, man. I see the conversations you guys have on Twitter, though, and I learn stuff from that, so that's great. Using the community as a resource is always good. So somebody stood over here a moment ago and, we take one more?
One more?
Do we got to get?
Okay.
All right.
Well, just
that was the
come talk to us.
Yeah.
We'll be here afterward.
we're around.
We'll be outside.
Thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you for coming.